thank you for joining us for the Ona Report monthly seminar. My name is John Arthington. I'm a professor and center director of the IFAS Range Cattle Research and Education Center here in Ona, and I'm going to present today's topic, which covers the Ona Report from July entitled Factors That Impact Shrink in Beef Cattle. At the end of my short seminar, everybody will have a chance to ask questions, and we'll address them at that time. If people that are joining us electronically over the webinar also have questions, they can type those in, and we'll retrieve them here and answer them at that time. Just as a reminder, this monthly seminar is an enhancement to our ongoing Ona Report, which is published every month in the Florida Cattleman Livestock Journal. It's an opportunity for people that have an interest in that topic that they've read about in the journal that month to interact with the author through this presentation and then ask questions that they might have at that time. So to get started, I wrote this last Ona Report on a topic that is of interest to me, and it's a topic that really has a broad impact on the beef cattle industry called shrink. Just a moment now. Okay, thanks, Chris. So just to introduce the topic of shrink, it's generally poorly understood by most cow-calf producers, but cattle buyers understand shrink very well. If we think about how animals, beef cattle, move through the production system from the time that they're born until the time that they're slaughtered, the topic of shrink can have an impact on every stage of that trade. But shrink is inevitable. It will always happen. But minimizing shrink can add considerable value to the animal that's being marketed. So as a hierarchy of order in terms of the amount of shrink that cattle will experience through these different stages of marketing, mature beef cows, or what we might call cull cows and cull bulls, will typically shrink the most. And then calves, weaned calves after that. Feeder cattle might be in the growing stages, will be next. And then finished cattle tend to have the least amount of shrink. Some of the factors that affect shrink are feed and water restriction, and that's a pretty obvious one, and one that I'm going to talk to you about as we go along. Trucking will impact shrink, or transportation. Cattle that are withheld from feed and water at the same amount of time will shrink more if they're transported during that period of time versus standing in a dry lot pen. Stress such as commingling and gathering will impact shrink. The amount of time that it takes to gather cattle into the cow pens has a big impact, and also the time of day that those cattle are gathered will also impact shrink. And then preconditioning. Pre-weaning cattle, keeping them on the ranch prior to transport and marketing will impact shrink as well. Throughout my presentation, I'll show you examples of each of these. Dr. Finley Pate was a former center director and an animal scientist here at the research center, and he and a couple of his friends in the industry introduced me to this topic when I first started here as a faculty member. And I wrote down this quote. I think he used this quote before, but I've used it in this talk as well. And it's considering the time involved, the short amount of time involved. There's more dollars that are made or lost from cattle shrink than any other phase of the beef cattle business. And this is really an important concept and something that, in terms of the economics of beef cattle production, has a big value. I've updated this slide just to give you an idea. Generally, we think about shrink in the value of 6 to 8%. We think about cattle that are transported out of South Florida, weaned calves, that might be going into West Texas. It's a 24-hour trip. Those cattle will probably shrink around 6 to 8%. That means they will lose 6 to 8% of their body weight that they had at the time they were separated from the cow the day before, by the time that they're received. And you can look here, we just sold our steer calves here at Ona in June for an August delivery date. Those calves will probably wean about, steer calves about 600 pounds. We sold them for a value of about $800. So if we look at the amount of loss of that value in terms of shrink, going from 0 to 10%, you can see it here on this slide. It's a significant amount just due to the loss of body weight over that period of time. So there's two different kinds of shrink, and one of them is called fill, and that's usually considered the intestinal contents or ruminal contents that that animal has that it will lose over that first 24-hour period. It's made up of urine, feces, and rumen fill, or forage or feed that that animal's eating. But then there's also tissue shrink, and this is the shrink that comes during and after gut fill shrink, and it's related to decreases in carcass weight, generally also related to losses in hydration with tissue or intra and extracellular fluid loss. So fill shrink is usually quickly overcome, and here's an interesting table that kind of tells you how that body weight is lost and how it can be regained. This is simply cattle that are removed from pasture, grazing cattle removed from pasture and held in a dry lot pen without access to feed and water. And if you look at the loss of calf body weight, those calves are weighing 688 pounds immediately removed from pasture, and then look at the percent body weight loss up to 24 hours. And there you can see the 8% body weight loss, or 8% shrink 24 hours later, all right, with that loss of body weight. Almost all of that is this gut fill shrink that we talked about before, with probably a little bit of tissue shrink as well. Now, when they're returned to pasture, you can see that with only 6 hours of grazing time, ability to consume adequate forage, and also drink water, they regain all of that body weight. So in a very short period of time, generally considered about 10 hours of time, gut fill shrink will be regained, okay? Now, as a rule of thumb, cattle will typically shrink 1% of their body weight every hour for about 4 hours when they don't have access to water or feed. Right? That's all gut fill shrink, about 1% an hour for 3 to 4 hours. And then after 4 hours, this rate of shrink decreases dramatically, declines about 0.1% per hour up to 10 hours. Now, tissue shrink is usually associated with very long periods of feed and water withdrawal or very long-hauled cattle, cattle that are transported or trucked over 20 hours and held off of feed and water for an extended period of time. And you can see where this tissue shrink is coming from if we add up all of that loss over a 10-hour period. These are on yearling feeder cattle that are hauled for 24 hours. It's a smaller amount of the total, certainly, but it does make up an important part of the total amount of shrink or body weight loss. Now, shrink affects the buyer and the seller, and so negotiating that shrink is almost always a condition that occurs. Generally, for cattle shipped out of South Florida, if you look at truckload quantities, it's almost always a shared loss between the buyer and seller. For example, you will often see the term 3% pencil shrink. What that means is that there's a difference between the gross weight and the pay weight, and that difference is generally 3%. Sometimes it can be 0, or it can be higher than 3%. But what that means is if the cattle are sold at a weight of 600 pounds, that is the pay weight. And the actual gross weight laid off of the cow immediately at weaning would be approximately 3% greater. Now, what would happen then on these cattle that are shipped approximately 24 hours to West Texas, those cattle might shrink 6 to 7%, and so the buyer and seller are sharing half of that shrink equally. So the diet prior to shipping will also impact the amount of shrink, but this is highly variable for reasons that probably are obvious to you. Cattle that are placed on in a dry lot with hay will typically shrink less than cattle that were gathered off of lush pasture. And the reason for that is that it slows the amount or the rate of passage of that feed through the intestinal system, right through the gastrointestinal tract. So if they're on lush pasture, there's a faster rate of movement. They're going to lose that, thus greater shrink. But if it's a poorly or less digestible forage, it will pass slower, and they won't lose it, and then thus more shrink, or I'm sorry, less shrink. Now, there's also some reasoning that data would contradict this. If you're bringing cattle up from a lush pasture, there's a good chance they will lose a lot of that fecal matter due to the high passage rate prior to being loaded on the truck. And so it's already gone before they're weighed, and then they will appear to shrink less over that period of time on lush pasture. So all of this has to do with how fast or how efficiently they're gathered and loaded on the truck. But in general, this concept will hold true. Now, trucking also increases shrink, as I mentioned earlier. If you look at this slide here, between 8 and 24 hours, these calves are weighing the same at the time of cow-calf separation, but they're held in a dry mud versus placed on a truck. And you can see the differences are much greater in terms of the percentage body weight shrink when they're placed on a truck and hauled over that period of time versus standing in the dry mud. I want to show you some recent data that we collected last summer, and these are vaginal temperatures of replacement heifers over 13 days, with the environmental temperature at the top and vaginal temperature at the bottom. Now, this study was conducted at the same time as we are now last year, with average highs around 93 degrees Fahrenheit or 34 degrees Celsius. And you can see that every day when air temperature goes up, the body temperature of the heifers also goes up. Now, if you look at the bottom panel, that was day 6 to 7. And that's when we put the heifers on a truck and transported them over a 24-hour period. And you can see that the heifers had a peak in vaginal temperature with a quick decline over that one-day period. Well, the reason for that here, this is that one day now where they were transported, and you can see that the body temperature of those heifers peaks before the truck leaves, and that's due to the gathering process, working them through the cow pens and loading them onto the truck. Right? So these heifers have sensors that's taking their body temperature every 15 minutes through the whole process, and so they peak during that working time, loading onto the truck. But once the truck starts to move, the body temperature drops quickly. So you can see body temperature is actually going down before the air temperature of that day peaks. And so getting those heifers loaded, or those calves loaded, and getting them moving down the road with air circulation definitely helps overall body temperature. So this is a question of how do we gather cattle? Typically, calves are gathered early in the morning because the idea is that it's cooler at that time, be less stress on the calves, maybe less stress on the workers as well. This management procedure, however, may be more costly to the producer than what we originally thought. And the reason for that is that particularly in the summer hot months, the majority of the day's grazing occurs in the morning hours. All right, the majority of the day's grazing occurs during those early morning hours. And so if we go out and gather those calves before they've had a time to consume that morning's grazing, we're going to impact overall shrink. Now, here's some work by Ken Coffey from the University of Arkansas, where they looked at gathering times from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. And then if you look down 3 lines, you can see that the sale weight increases as we allow the calves more time to graze in the morning. And that provides more value in terms of overall value to those calves. Now, what I did is I took the current prices for calves weighing about 680 pounds, and then that added body weight gain, I took 2/3 of that price per pound for the value of the added weight, which kind of follows what Dr. Coffey did in his evaluation. But you can see that turns out to be about 26, 27 pounds or dollars in today's value by just allowing allowing them to graze a little bit longer in the morning, if that's possible. All of this is the result of a management system that's impacting shrink. So this shrink recovery can happen quickly, particularly if there's not a lot of tissue shrink involved. Now, in this particular study, they looked at the amount of shrink from ranch-derived calves or sale barn-derived calves. But the way the study was done is that the calves were taken from the ranch to the sale barn and then moved to the producer's location or the buyer's location. So you had one more step in the process, and you can see that through that you have greater shrink with the sale barn calves. All right, that could be at least understood. But the recovery time in terms of overall days is about the same for the two. So although you have more shrink, as long as the calves stay healthy, the recovery time is about the same. Here's some data that we collected at Ona, but it's very typical to the data you see in the literature, where if you take calves and you wean them at the ranch for 45 days, get them over the stress of weaning and get them eating, that's called preconditioning. And generally, preconditioned calves will shrink more than non-preconditioned calves. And here on the y-axis, that's a percent of their body weight from the time of weaning. So they all have body weight loss at day 1, and then they regain that body weight over about a 7 to 10 day period, as you can see on this figure. But that's a typical response, probably because of greater ruminal development. They just have greater ruminal contents to lose during that shrink process. So my last slide is just some additional findings that were published in 2012 by Gonzalez and co-workers. It's in a 2-part manuscript, but it showed that there are significant animal well-being issues other than just the economic issues related to shrink, managing the conditions around shrink. What they found is that shrink up to 6 to 8% for long-haul cattle, as long as they remain healthy, is pretty normal. They can regain it rapidly, as the data that we've shown at least supports. Shrink over 8% starts to cause problems, and they see a strong correlation between the incidence of lameness in cattle when shrink starts to exceed 8%, suggesting that there's a well-being issue. Also, they found something interesting in that cattle that are hauled by drivers with more than 6 years of experience driving cattle shrink less than cattle that are hauled by drivers with less than 6 years of experience. I find that pretty interesting as well, and it's probably related to keeping those cattle on the road, keeping them cool as long as they can, and having short stops along the way. At least the authors suggested that, because drivers with a lot of experience understand the importance of animal well-being and care for those animals on the road. So, summary, shrink is, I hope I've convinced you that shrink's a major factor influencing the value of beef calves. Shrink is also unavoidable. It will happen, but it can be minimized. Shrink is negotiated with the buyer. It's generally shared between the buyer and seller. If it's possible, particularly for fresh weaned cattle being marketed, if you gather those cattle late in the day, you can impact shrink. Transition cattle to drier rations if possible, if they're grazing very lush pastures. Certainly try to minimize the standing time, both in the pens and at the sale barn. Some time ago, we gave a presentation to a group of producers at a sale barn. I learned something interesting there, that the sale barn owners and managers allowed buyers to jump to the front of the line when they brought their cattle in, meaning that once they unloaded the cattle, they could go straight to the sale ring if they would agree to sell them in small groups versus individuals. A lot of times cattle producers, when they sell their cattle, they like to have them sold one at a time. But this was an opportunity to not have your cattle wait all day before they're sold if you would agree to sell them in small groups. It's efficient for both, but certainly could save a lot in terms of shrink loss. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and try to address any questions that you might have. Any questions from the group here at Ona? Nothing? I might add too that there's a nice article in Feedstuffs, a weekly magazine on shrimp by Dr. Ken Coffey. If anybody on the webinar or here in the room would like to have a copy of it, I'd be happy to email it to you. Sure.
Do you think it's protein gas with very fruitful of animals and a very not so full?
So the question is, what about trucking cattle with full trucks versus not so full? So in this report by Gonzalez, they looked at a lot of different factors related to trucking conditions. Could not find any correlations between those. But intuitively, I would think that overcrowding would have an impact on health and productivity. I don't know about shrink, but it probably would have an impact on overall health and the incidence of illness or injury, I would think. But they couldn't find any significant correlations.
Calves that were pre-conditioned calves versus calves that were.
Yes.
How many days were those calves pre-conditioned?
In our study, they were preconditioned 45 days, which is a typical minimum amount to be considered for these preconditioning programs. That's what we did, 45 days. I would suggest, however, individuals that are interested in preconditioning really use that only as a minimum, because more days out probably results in greater benefit from the preconditioning process. If they're going to invest in it for that long of a period, you might as well go another couple weeks, because they really start going back. Okay, thank you for your attention.